I snapped awake at 2014 in the morning for no reason I could name. That used to happen sometimes when I was little. My mother would call it the body, knowing before the mind does. I lay there in the dark, listening to the house settle, and felt something cold spread through my chest before I even turned to look at the other side of the bed. My husband's pillow was cold. Not the warm kind of empty, where someone just slipped to the bathroom and will be back in a minute. Cold like he'd been gone for a while. I sat up and pressed my palm flat against the sheet. Nothing. I padded to the window, telling myself it was nothing. He couldn't sleep. He'd gone to get water. Maybe he was watching television downstairs. But when I peered through the blinds, his truck was gone. The driveway where he always parked, right beside my sedan, was just an empty rectangle of concrete under the porch light. My husband never went anywhere at night. In 4 years of marriage, I could not recall a single instance of him leaving the house after 10. He was fanatical about his sleep schedule. 7 hours exactly. Lights out by 11, alarm at 6. He said it was one of the things that kept him sharp at work. I used to tease him about it. I stood at the window for a full minute, waiting for his headlights to swing back into the driveway. They didn't come. My phone showed no text from him, no missed calls. I tried calling. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I tried again. Same thing. I almost climbed back into bed and told myself he'd gone to get something at a gas station, that there was a reasonable explanation for all of it. But then I thought about my mother. 3 days earlier, on a Tuesday afternoon, my mother had called me from her house. She lived 40 minutes outside of Knoxville in a small property on the edge of the National Forest, the same house I'd grown up in. 2 bedrooms, a wide porch, big old hickory trees in the backyard that dropped nuts every fall. She'd bought it with my father before he passed. She'd never left. She'd sounded strange on the phone that Tuesday. Not frightened exactly, more like careful, choosing each word deliberately. She asked if I was coming to see her that weekend. I told her yes, same as always, Saturday afternoon. She said good. She said she had something she wanted to show me. Something she'd found in some papers of my father's that she thought I should see. I asked her what kind of papers. She said she'd rather show me in person. I told her that was fine. I'd see her Saturday. That was the last time I spoke to her. Wednesday evening, when she didn't answer her phone for 6 hours, I drove out there. The front door was unlocked, which was unusual. My mother locked everything. She'd grown up with 3 older brothers who broke things, and she said good locks were just good sense. I walked through the house calling her name. The kettle on the stove was cold, but there was a half-drunk cup of tea on the kitchen table like she'd stepped away from it and not come back. Her reading glasses were folded beside it. She never went far without her glasses. She was gone. I called the sheriff's department and a deputy came and took a report. He was polite and thorough and explained that since there was no sign of struggle, they'd likely wait 24 hours before launching anything official. He suggested she might have gone to a neighbor's house or driven somewhere and not told anyone. I told him my mother didn't do things like that without telling anyone. He nodded and wrote everything down and told me someone would follow up. My husband had been with me when I drove out there that Wednesday. He'd held my hand on the drive home and said my mother was probably fine, probably just went to see a friend and forgot to charge her phone. He was calm and solid about it in the way that had steadied me. I'd needed someone to be calm, and he had been. Now it was 2 in the morning and he was gone, and I was standing in our bedroom with both hands pressed against my phone and the cold feeling in my chest growing into something I couldn't name. I got dressed without thinking. Jeans, a sweatshirt, my old sneakers. I grabbed my keys and drove south toward my mother's house, keeping my headlights on because I told myself I was being paranoid. I was just going to check. I just needed to see the house was still there and quiet. I was 20 minutes out when I saw his truck. He pulled off onto a fire road that cut back into the forest about a mile before my mother's property. It was a road I'd driven past 100 times growing up without ever taking it anywhere. The truck was parked at an angle, half hidden by a stand of pines. If I hadn't been watching for him, I'd have missed it entirely. I killed my headlights and coasted to the shoulder. My heart was going so fast I could feel it in my jaw. He was at the back of the truck. In the pale light from his phone's flashlight, I could see him clearly enough. He was digging. He brought a long-handled shovel and he was working at the soft earth beside a drainage ditch, throwing dirt aside with steady, methodical effort, not frantic, not rushing, like a man doing a job he planned. I sat in my car and I watched him for 10 minutes. He dug the hole, set the shovel aside, and pulled something from the truck bed. A metal lockbox, the kind you bolt under a desk or put in a gun safe, about the size of a shoebox. He dropped it into the hole, smoothed the dirt back over it with the flat of the shovel, pressed it down with his boot, and scattered dead leaves across the top. Then he loaded the shovel back into the truck, climbed in, and drove the other direction, deeper down the fire road, away from me. I did not follow him. I sat there in the dark with my hands on the steering wheel and my mind completely white and empty. I thought about my mother's empty teacup. I thought about the careful, deliberate way she'd spoken on the phone. I thought about my husband's hand steady on mine as he told me everything was probably fine. Then I took out my phone and called 911. Detective Anita Walsh arrived at the fire road before dawn, with 2 deputies and a forensic technician she'd pulled from another call. She was in her mid-40s, compact and direct, with close-cropped natural hair and the particular stillness of someone used to absorbing bad information without flinching. She introduced herself, shook my hand, and asked me to show her exactly where he'd been digging. I walked them to the drainage ditch. The leaves he'd scattered looked almost undisturbed to a casual eye, but the technician crouched and ran his flashlight low across the ground and pointed at the edges where the soil was freshly turned. They dug carefully with evidence tools, not shovels. When they reached the lockbox, they photographed it from every angle before lifting it out. It was locked with a 4-digit combination. They bagged it and tagged it. Detective Walsh led me to her car and sat across from me with a notepad. I told her everything. The call from my mother on Tuesday. Finding the house empty Wednesday evening. My husband's calm reassurance on the drive home. Waking at 2 a.m. and finding him gone. Following the sound of my own instinct down a road I'd known since childhood. She asked about my mother's property. Who owned it? Who had access? Whether my husband had ever expressed any interest in it. I told her my mother had owned it outright since my father died 6 years ago. I was her only child. The house and land would come to me when she passed. She asked whether my husband had financial pressures I was aware of. I started to say no, then stopped. There had been things. A second credit card I'd found in his desk drawer 8 months ago that I hadn't known existed, with a balance he'd explained as construction costs for a renovation job gone over budget. A weekend trip to Nashville last spring that he'd been vague about, saying it was for work, but he'd seemed off about it when he came home, jumpy and distracted for nearly a week. Small things I tucked away in the back of my mind and hadn't pulled out until now. I told her all of it. She wrote it down. They found my mother the next morning. She was in the crawl space of an abandoned hunting cabin a quarter mile into the forest behind her house, bound at the wrists and ankles with nylon rope. Badly dehydrated and with a deep laceration along her hairline, from what the paramedics said looked like a blow from a blunt object. She was alive. Barely, but alive. I was at the hospital by 10. She was conscious by noon. She took my hand and held it so hard her knuckles went white. She told Detective Walsh what she remembered in a voice still rough from dehydration. A man had knocked at her back door Wednesday afternoon saying his truck had broken down and asking if he could use her phone. She'd opened the door. She lived alone in the forest, and she knew all her neighbors, and this man's face was unfamiliar. But something about his manner had seemed off from the first second too rehearsed. And before she could close the door, he'd shoved inside and hit her with something she didn't see coming. She'd woken in the dark with her hands tied, not knowing where she was or how long she'd been there. She did not recognize the man. She could describe him. Late 30s, heavy build, dark jacket, a scar through one eyebrow. She hadn't seen anyone else. Detective Walsh kept her expression neutral while she took down the description. Afterward, in the hallway outside my mother's room, she told me that my husband had not yet been located. He'd been away from our house when deputies went to question him that morning. His phone was going to voicemail. She told me not to return home alone. I didn't. I slept in my mother's hospital room on a cot one of the nurses brought in. listening to the monitors and trying to understand what was happening inside the marriage I thought I'd understood. They arrested my husband 4 days later in Chattanooga. He'd been staying in a motel under a credit card I hadn't known he had. When they brought him in, he was quiet and cooperative in a way that Detective Walsh later told me was more frightening than if he'd fought. I went to his arraignment and sat in the gallery and watched a man I'd shared a bed with for 4 years sit at the defense table in a shirt his attorney had presumably brought him and not once look in my direction. Not once. The lockbox he'd buried on the fire road had been opened by then. Inside was a copy of my mother's homeowner's insurance policy, a life insurance policy with a face value of $600,000 and a handwritten list of numbers that took investigators 2 days to trace to a gambling debt operation in Atlanta. My husband owed them over $90,000. The due date had been 4 months away. He'd been paying down what he could. He'd drained the savings account I thought we shared, nearly $40,000 over 18 months, which I hadn't noticed because he managed the household finances and I had trusted him to do that. When the savings ran out, he'd taken a second mortgage I hadn't known about on a rental property he co-owned with a friend. None of it had been enough. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, he'd looked at my mother's land, 16 acres of national forest border with mineral rights intact, appraised the previous year at just over $1 million, and seen a solution. The prosecutor's investigator told me all of this across a conference table while I sat with my hands flat on the surface trying to breathe evenly. She was careful and patient about it. She asked if I had any questions. I had about 100, but the one that kept surfacing was not about the money or the debt or even the insurance policy. It was about the man with the scar through his eyebrow, the man my mother had described at her door. Because my husband's fingerprints were not in my mother's house. His boot treads did not match the impressions in the mud outside her back door. He buried that lockbox, but someone else had been inside. Detective Walsh came to see me the following Tuesday. She sat in the same conference room and laid a photograph on the table in front of me. A man with dark hair and a scar through his left eyebrow, mid-30s, staring at the camera with the flat expression of someone who'd been photographed that way before. His name was Marcus Riley. He had a record. 2 counts of aggravated assault, a weapons charge, a fraud case that had been pled down. He'd been arrested 2 days earlier at a pawn shop in Maryville trying to sell a bracelet that had been reported stolen from a house 3 counties over. When investigators ran his prints against the evidence from my mother's cabin, they found a match at the back door frame and on the nylon rope that had bound her wrists. He and my husband had grown up in the same county, Detective Walsh told me. Different schools, different neighborhoods, but there was a photograph on my husband's old Facebook account from 12 years ago, a cookout somewhere, both of them standing at a grill. Old acquaintances, the kind of connection you don't advertise. Walsh said she believed she knew what had happened. She said she'd seen versions of it before and it never got easier to hear. She said my husband had found Marcus through some mutual contact in the gambling circles, offered him money to make my mother's death look like a home invasion, and Marcus had taken the job and then panicked when my mother wouldn't stay down and the whole thing fell apart before he could finish it. He dumped her in the cabin and run, and my husband had spent 3 days waiting to hear that she'd been found dead, and instead heard that she'd been found alive and talking to police. That was when he'd run too. I asked Walsh what was in the lockbox. I already knew the answer, but I needed to say it out loud. I needed to hear her say it back. She told me. The insurance policy was made out to me. I was the beneficiary. $600,000, which would have gone to me on my mother's death and which, as my husband, he could have accessed through the ordinary financial machinery of marriage. The other documents were his calculations. How much the land would sell for, how much the debt would eat up, how much would be left. There was a number at the bottom of the last page in his handwriting. $140,000. That's what he calculated would remain after everything was settled. $140,000. That's what my mother's life had been worth to him in the margin of a notebook page. I drove to the hospital after that meeting and sat beside my mother for 3 hours without telling her any of it. She was getting better, stronger, every day, and she kept asking me what was wrong, and I kept saying nothing, just tired. She held my hand and told me I didn't have to stay, I could go rest. I told her I wanted to stay. At some point, she fell asleep, and I sat there in the quiet and let myself feel all of it. Not just the betrayal, though that was enormous and present in every part of me. The other thing, too. The smaller, uglier thing. The fact that I'd ignored what I'd seen. The credit card in the drawer. The quiet weekend he'd been vague about. The way he'd squeezed my hand on the drive home from my mother's empty house, steady and calm while somewhere inside he already knew why she wasn't there. I thought about every time I'd pushed those small worries aside and told myself I was being anxious, being difficult, being a woman who needed to calm down and trust her husband. I thought about that for a long time. My husband's attorney filed for bail and the judge granted it. The bond was set at $300,000. I don't know how he paid it. I didn't know enough about his finances anymore to trace where any money came from. His attorney posted the bond and he walked out of the Knoxville Detention Center on a Thursday afternoon. I'd filed for a restraining order the same morning. The judge signed it by noon. My husband was prohibited from coming within 500 feet of me, my place of work, or my mother's hospital room. He violated it 8 days later. I was at my friend's apartment, where I'd been staying since the arrest. She lived on the 3rd floor of the building in Midtown, quiet and secure, the kind of place I'd felt safe. I was in her kitchen, making coffee, when she came in from the balcony with a strange look and told me there was a truck parked across the street that had been there for 2 hours and she thought I should look at it. I looked out the window. His truck. Same dull gray he'd owned since before we were married. I called Detective Walsh before I even stepped back from the window. She had a patrol car there in 11 minutes. My husband drove away before they arrived, but the dash cam on a delivery van parked nearby had caught it all on video. The truck, his plate, him sitting in the driver's seat watching my window for nearly 2 hours. Walsh told me later he'd made a mistake that was going to cost him significantly in court. It cost him more than she expected. When they pulled him over on the interstate an hour later, he had a burner phone in his center console with text messages on it that investigators spent 3 days going through. There were 6 conversations with Marcus Riley spanning 8 months. The earliest ones were vague, the kind of thing a defense attorney could argue was innocent. But the ones from the 2 weeks before my mother went missing were not vague at all. My husband had provided Marcus with my mother's address, her daily schedule, the combination to the back gate lock she'd put in 3 years ago for the landscaper, and a photograph he'd taken on one of our visits without my knowing. My mother in her backyard with her back to the camera, the house clearly visible behind her. The last text before the attack read, "Make it look like a break-in. Don't leave her able to talk." His bail was revoked. He went back into custody the same day and didn't come out again. I found the thing my mother had wanted to show me on a Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks after she was released from the hospital. She was staying with me by then, in the spare room of my friend's apartment while I looked for a new place to live. She'd remembered what she'd been meaning to tell me, and she pulled a manila envelope from her bag and set it on the kitchen table with a steadiness I recognized as the kind that costs something to maintain. Inside was a letter from my father, written 4 months before he died. He'd given it to my mother and told her to put it somewhere safe and show me when she thought the time was right. She'd read it once and put it away and not touched it again for 6 years because she hadn't been sure the time was ever going to be right. My father had written it in his careful, deliberate handwriting, the kind of script from a generation that was taught to form letters properly. He wrote that before he got sick, he'd updated his will and had added a clause I hadn't known about. In addition to the house and property going to my mother and then to me, he'd set aside a trust for my benefit, funded by the sale of a small commercial property he'd owned quietly for 20 years. A warehouse space he'd been leasing to a printing company and never mentioned to anyone because he'd been a private man about money, and he'd wanted it to be a clean gift when the time came. The trust was worth $400,000. It had been sitting untouched in a bank account for 6 years, administered by his attorney, waiting. It was mine, had always been mine. Nothing that my husband could have touched. My father, careful and private to the end, had protected me without my knowing. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time holding that letter. My mother sat across from me and didn't say anything, which was what I needed. Outside, it had started to rain, a soft Tennessee spring rain that came in sideways through the screen and smelled like earth and pine. Eventually, my mother said, "Your father always worried about you." Not in a bad way. He just loved you so much he couldn't stop thinking about what might happen if he wasn't around. I folded the letter carefully back into the envelope. I thought about what might have happened if my mother had died before she could show me this. My husband would have inherited nothing. The plan he'd constructed so carefully, the debt calculations in that lockbox, the $600,000 he'd been counting on, all of it built on an understanding of our finances that was already wrong before it started. He tried to murder my mother for money he would never have gotten. The trial lasted 9 days. I testified on the third day. The prosecutor, a methodical woman named Diane Marsh who had 22 years in the district attorney's office and a reputation for not raising her voice in court, walked me through the night on the fire road. The shovel, the lockbox, my husband's stillness and calculation. She asked me to look at the jury when I described the text message on the burner phone. I did. Several of them looked away first. My husband's attorney argued that the texts had been taken out of context, that Marcus Riley was an unreliable witness who'd made a deal with prosecutors to reduce his own sentence, and that the financial evidence demonstrated desperation but not intent to kill. He was composed and professional, and the argument was the best that could be made with what he had. It was not enough. The jury came back in 7 hours with a verdict on all counts. Conspiracy to commit murder, solicitation to commit aggravated assault, obstruction of justice, violation of a restraining order, financial fraud. My husband stood at the defense table and received each count without visible reaction, and I sat in the gallery and watched and felt something in my chest go very quiet. Not peaceful exactly, but finished. Like a sound that had been going on so long I'd stopped hearing it had finally stopped. The sentencing happened a month later. The judge gave him 38 years. With sentencing enhancements for premeditation and the violation of the restraining order, he would not be eligible for parole consideration until he was in his 70s. Marcus Riley had taken his deal, 15 years for aggravated assault and conspiracy, in exchange for full cooperation and testimony. My mother had been in the courtroom for that sentencing. She sat very straight and watched the judge hand down the sentence and did not look away. Afterward, in the parking lot, she took my arm and we walked to the car and she didn't say anything about it. She said she was hungry and asked if I wanted to get lunch. We went to a diner on the edge of downtown and ordered the same thing we always ordered, chicken soup for her, a club sandwich for me, and we sat at a table by the window and talked about ordinary things. The weather. The garden she wanted to plant when she got back to the house. Whether I thought she needed new gutters on the east side. I let her talk. I needed to hear it. The ordinariness of it. The proof that life had something on the other side of all of this that was just lunch and gutters and the possibility of a garden. I found a house 8 months after the verdict. A small craftsman bungalow in East Knoxville, far enough from anywhere I'd lived with my husband that nothing in the neighborhood held any echo of him. 2 bedrooms, a porch in front, a yard in back with an old oak tree that would be beautiful in the fall. My mother helped me move in on a Saturday in October with my closest friends, and we ordered pizza afterward and sat on the floor of the empty living room because the furniture hadn't arrived yet, and ate out of the boxes and laughed about things that had nothing to do with any of it. That night after everyone left, I sat alone on the porch steps with a cup of tea and listened to the neighborhood settle into evening. Someone nearby was playing music softly. A dog was barking somewhere down the block. The air smelled like wood smoke and turning leaves. The specific smell of October in East Tennessee that I'd grown up with and left behind when I got married and moved closer to the city, and somehow never stopped missing. I thought about what I'd have said to myself 4 years ago, sitting across a dinner table from a man I thought I knew, listening to him talk about his day, believing in the ordinary safety of the life we'd built together. I would not have believed any of this, not because I was naive exactly, but because he'd been careful. He'd been patient and careful, and the deception had been built so slowly, piece by piece, that by the time I was living in the middle of it, I'd lost the ability to see its shape. I thought about my mother waking up in the dark of that cabin, hands bound, not knowing where she was. I thought about her reading glasses folded beside the cold cup of tea on her kitchen table, waiting for her to come back. I thought about my father's letter, the trust account he put in place without telling anyone, the quiet, steady love of a man who'd looked ahead and done what he could. I was 33 years old. I had a house with an oak tree in the backyard. I had a mother who was sleeping in her own bed 40 minutes away in the house she'd never left. I had a job I was good at and friends who'd helped me carry boxes and eat pizza on the floor. I had $400,000 in a trust account and the knowledge that it had always been mine. I was not the woman who'd lain awake at 2 a.m. convincing herself there was a reasonable explanation. I didn't think I would ever be her again. The oak tree in the backyard was dropping its first leaves when I sat down to write all of this out. Not because I thought anyone would read it, but because I needed to say it somewhere. I needed to put it somewhere outside of myself, in language, so I could look at it clearly. What I know now that I didn't know then is that the instinct that woke me up that night at 2:14 was real. The cold feeling in my chest was information. I'd been trained for a long time to call it anxiety and set it aside and keep moving. I know women who have spent years calling it that. I was one of them. I don't know that I have advice exactly. I'm not sure this is the kind of thing that comes with advice. What I have is this. I followed that feeling down a road I'd driven 100 times as a child, and at the end of it was the truth I needed, and my mother is alive. That's enough. For now, that's everything.